It was 1776. A group of colonies, with neither a great army nor a powerful navy, challenged the strongest empire on earth. The British Empire controlled nearly half the world. Its army was larger, better trained and more experienced, and the Royal Navy was considered the most powerful fleet on the planet. The economy, resources and military experience were all on Britain's side. But in America, the empire would begin to lose control. Taxes, political pressure and growing British control pushed the colonies closer and closer to rebellion. In the port of Boston, men would throw tea worth thousands into the sea. Gunshots in Lexington would ignite a war, and the name George Washington would become legend. This is the story of the war that created the United States of America. In the 18th century, Britain controlled 13 colonies in North America. The colonies were growing rapidly. Trade created enormous wealth. The population increased year after year. But so did anger toward Britain. After the 7 Years' War ended in 1763, Britain was left drowning in debt. London decided the colonies would have to pay more. New taxes were introduced on paper, newspapers, legal documents, and even tea. But the problem was not only money. The colonists had no representatives in the British Parliament. That is when a famous phrase was born: no taxation without representation. The colonies still tried to find a peaceful solution. Twice they appealed to King George III in search of compromise, but the king ignored their requests. And after that, many colonists realized that peace was no longer possible. Tensions between Britain and the colonies continued to rise. In 1770, British soldiers opened fire on civilians in Boston. Several colonists were killed. The event became known as the Boston Massacre. But the true explosion came because of tea. In 1773, the British government gave the East India Company a monopoly over tea sales. The colonists saw it as another attempt to tighten British control. On December 16, 1773, a group of men disguised themselves as Native Americans. They boarded British ships in Boston Harbour and threw more than 300 chests of tea into the sea. Britain was furious. The port of Boston was shut down. British troops were sent into the colonies, and now war became only a matter of time. On April 19, 1775, British troops marched toward Lexington and Concord. Their mission was to seize colonial weapons and supplies. But local militias were already waiting. A shot was fired. A shot later remembered as the shot heard around the world. The American Revolution had begun. At first, the fighting was carried out by local militias and volunteers. Later, the colonies formed the Continental Army, led by George Washington. In the early stages of the war, the Americans often relied on guerrilla tactics. The British controlled major cities and the sea, but not the entire land. Some Native American tribes supported Britain and also carried out guerrilla attacks. The British were also supported by loyalists, American colonists who remained loyal to the Crown. After the war, many of them would flee to Canada and other British territories, the war was brutal. The Americans suffered heavy losses and lost battle after battle. At one point, Washington commanded only around 18,000 men. The British had up to 50,000 trained professional soldiers. Slowly, the Americans began winning one of the first major successes came at Fort Ticonderoga, where colonial forces captured valuable British artillery. In New York, colonists pulled down a statue of King George III. Later, the metal was melted into musket bullets. Another little-known fact: the colonies supported privateers, essentially legalized pirates. They attacked British trade ships and shared the captured wealth with the colonies. Meanwhile, Benjamin Franklin was sent to Paris to seek French support. That decision would become one of the most important moments of the entire war. On July 4, 1776, the colonies officially declared independence from Britain. The Declaration of Independence was signed. The main text was written by Thomas Jefferson. The document declared that all men are created equal and have the right to liberty. But the issue of slavery remained unresolved, and in the future it would lead America into another devastating war. At first, Britain seemed unstoppable, but gradually the balance of the war began to change. In 1777, the Americans won the Battle of Saratoga. That victory convinced France to openly support the colonies. France provided money, weapons, supplies, and a navy. A Prussian officer named Friedrich von Steuben arrived in America. He helped transform poorly trained militias into a disciplined fighting force. Later, Spain also entered the war. At first, Spain provided naval and financial support. Later, Spanish forces directly fought against Britain. Holland would also become involved in the conflict. Step by step, Britain found itself fighting enemies across the world. The war was fought not only on land, but also across the oceans. French, Spanish, Holland, and British fleets fought for control of trade routes and naval supremacy. Despite constant setbacks, the Americans slowly began gaining momentum, and the war became more and more expensive for Britain. On October 19, 1781, British forces became trapped at Yorktown. Washington's army and French forces surrounded the British by land and sea. General Cornwallis signed the surrender. For Britain, it was a disaster. The empire was buried in debt, and support for the war began collapsing even inside Britain itself. On September 3, 1783, a peace treaty was signed between Great Britain and the United States. Britain officially recognized American independence. The American Revolution became a massive blow to every nation involved in the conflict. Britain lost colonies, money, and part of its global prestige. France helped America win, but soon would face revolution and chaos at home. Spain gained very little from the war, and despite victory, the United States inherited enormous internal problems. In our opinion, this war marked the moment the world truly began to change. For the first time, colonies had defeated one of the strongest empires on Earth. But together with freedom came problems that would divide America for decades. Slavery, political struggles, economic conflict, and eventually civil war. The seeds of all of them had already been planted during the Revolution. But this war also created a new nation. A nation that would eventually become one of the most powerful countries in history. The story of the United States did not begin in the White House. It began with the sound of a musket shot on a cold morning in 1775. Subscribe for more historical stories.